Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Maryland. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. It was late autumn of 1908 when the case file first came into the hands of the local county clerk in Allegheny County. The wind off the Potomac was cold, and the evening mist clung low to the hills. In the small town of Grayson's Hollow, remote, perched near ridges and hollowed valleys, word had spread of a morgue keeper whose name until then appeared only in obscure ledger entries. Silas Merrow. He answered to no one in the town's public directory. He worked for a privately contracted medical examiner's office, hidden in a side alley behind the regional hospital. Records show Merrow arrived in Grayson's Hollow in spring 1908. A slim man in his early 40s, he was said to carry a surgical satchel and wore a dark wool vest over a stark white shirt. The morgue building itself was an old stone structure just behind the hospital, its rear facade scarred by mildew and its windows shuttered. Locals said it had been part of the original hospital grounds, repurposed quietly as the town grew. Among the few who knew him, rumors circulated of his quiet habits. Some called him the Silent Steward because he rarely spoke in public and always at odd hours. The town's newspaper, the Grayson Gazette, ran a small note in June 1908. Merrow, morgue keeper, beginning late hours, under contract to hospital board. No public announcement made. That was the only mention. The lore of Maryland's history, as captured in sources like History of Maryland, notes that in the early 20th century, this region was often bypassed by major industrial growth, leaving small towns like Grayson's Hollow, isolated and secretive. That isolation would prove fertile ground for odd tales. A casual reference to that context finds grounding in the broader state history. Merrow's official duties were uneventful at first. Morgue receipts, burial permits, transport logs, these passed through his hands. One name that appears repeatedly is Dr. Marion Hawks, the medical examiner in Cumberland, whose distant office oversaw several districts. Merrow corresponded by mail with Hawks. Requests for supplies, specimen transfers, requests to delay release of remains pending additional tests, those became more frequent by September. That autumn, villagers reported oddness. Mrs. Harriet Fowler, who lived behind the hospital, wrote in a letter that she heard muffled scraping noises at midnight, just beyond her rear wall. Others said they saw a faint lantern glow through the morgue's rear window at 2 a.m. on nights when Merrow was not on duty. One youth, Thomas Ridley, claimed he glimpsed Merrow emerging from the morgue's back door, trembling, as though clutching something heavy. Still, these were whispers. No formal complaint was made. The constable, George Latham, visited the morgue once in early November after a neighbor insisted a foul odor emanated near the rear stairwell entrance. He knocked, received no answer. He noted the wooden trapdoor covering a set of steps descending beneath the building. He recorded in his journal, "Cover secured, no motion, air stale, returned." He left without further inspection. The first disappearance tied to the morgue came in mid-November. A young delivery man, Jonathan Black, failed to return home. His last known route passed the hospital alley. Black's fiancée, Martha, petitioned the constable to search the morgue property. Latham visited again that night, accompanied by two for deeper search authority. Merrow, when questioned by a visiting hospital official, claimed he left early that evening to fetch supplies in Cumberland, arriving after dark. But railroad schedules and ticket stubs later suggested he could not have made the trip. Merrow's alibi began to unravel. By December, local gossip had turned dark. Some said the morgue keeper carried bodies down those steps at dead hours. Others said he stored bodies for weeks, awaiting something. One elderly local, Amos Steele, swore he saw Merrow descend into the darkness with a body-laden trolley, then close the trapdoor behind him. Steele's affidavit, dated December 11th, reads, "I dared not follow. The door shut with a thud. I heard breathing." Within the emerging story, the morgue and its keeper became a locked puzzle. The shadowed steps beneath the trapdoor were known to a few. By the first week of December 1908, The morgue stood cold and silent against the frost that crept along its stone walls. Few approached it after dusk. Even the hospital attendants, who once came to collect burial tags or supplies, began leaving their paperwork on the outer step rather than enter. In the constable's record book, a short notation appeared on December 7th. Keeper withdrawn, no public presence, door locked from within. The townsfolk whispered that Silas Merrow had taken ill, yet no doctor had been called to see him. What little light shone from the morgue at night seemed erratic, flickering as if from a lantern turned low. In the small cafe near the post office, older men muttered over their coffee that he's gone strange in the head. There is evidence from an archived letter written by Dr. Marion Hawkes in Cumberland that Hawkes had grown uneasy. The letter, now preserved among the county's surviving files, reads, "Our agent in Grayson's Hollow delays reports and sends incomplete specimen manifests. Advise inspection." That inspection, however, never occurred. A storm rolled in the same week, cutting off telegraph lines and freezing the road that wound down from the ridge. For nearly 10 days, Grayson's Hollow was isolated. During that time, 2 further incidents unsettled the townspeople. First, a vagrant named Elias Quinn was found collapsed near the rail yard, his skin pale as chalk. Before he died, he told the nurse who tended him that he had seen the man in the cellar. She took it for delirium, but the phrase was repeated in her testimony months later. The second was the disappearance of Mrs. Harriet Fowler, the same widow who had written earlier of noises near her back wall. Her house stood directly behind the morgue. The rear gate between her property and the hospital yard was found open, prints leading both ways until they vanished in snow. The constable, constrained by weather and lacking deputies, could do little. He recorded, "House cold, untouched, door fastened from inside, signs of movement under rear fence." He sealed the property and waited for thaw. When the storm passed and the first train from Cumberland arrived, a single passenger stepped off, Dr. Hawkes, summoned by the hospital board. Hawkes and Latham entered the morgue together on December 18th. Inside, they found the upper chamber still and immaculate, metal tables polished, instruments aligned. But near the back corner, the trapdoor cover had been shifted, one hinge torn slightly loose, as if pried upward from below. Hawkes knelt, brushed frost from the edge, and noted a faint odor, resembling chemical decay. They lifted the cover with effort, the hinges squealed. A narrow stairwell descended into blackness. Latham lowered a lantern. The light reached only the first few steps, slick with moisture. No movement. The air that rose was cold and stale, but tinged with a hint of disinfectant. Hawkes proposed sealing the stair until daylight. Latham agreed, nailing the hinge back into place. That night, both men filed separate reports, but only Latham survives. In it he wrote, "Trapdoor resealed, keeper absent, premises secured." By morning, Silas Merrow was gone. His bed unslept, clothing missing, payroll envelope left unopened. The train clerk swore no man by that name boarded the line. The next entry in the record came 3 days later, a note from the hospital board declaring the morgue temporarily unstaffed. Afterward, the building stood quiet except for the occasional stray cat seen slipping beneath the shutters. Decades later, archivists piecing together the case would remark how every file from that week had been singed along its edges, as though in the days that followed Merrow's disappearance, the town of Grayson's Hollow entered a state of uneasy silence. The snow melted in patches along the hospital yard, revealing dark streaks of soil where footsteps had been. Constable Latham made rounds twice daily, checking the locked door of the morgue. No movement was seen, yet on 2 occasions the lamp above the entry had been relit overnight. Latham replaced the wick, extinguished it, and noted in his log, "Lantern burning without fuel replaced. No explanation." Dr. Hawkes returned to Cumberland, but left orders for the hospital board to appoint a replacement custodian. None volunteered. A report filed January 3, 1909, summarized it plainly. Property remained sealed, interim supervision denied. But the building did not remain empty for long. One of the hospital attendants, a timid orderly named Frederick Ives, later confessed to sneaking inside to retrieve equipment. His deposition, dated 1910 after his arrest for unrelated theft, became one of the few first-hand accounts of what lay beneath the morgue. He claimed that the trapdoor had been forced open, and the staircase below led into a corridor of brick arches, each side stacked with decaying crates labeled specimens. He spoke of the smell, chemical and sweet, like rotting fruit, and said he saw hooks driven into the beams above, some still looped with twine. Ives's statement was dismissed as the ravings of a desperate thief, yet a detail he provided matched Hawks's earlier notes about chemical decay. The history of Maryland recounts that during this era, rural counties struggled to regulate medical waste and anatomy specimens. Many local practitioners operated under vague contracts for scientific use. It seems Merrow had exploited that ambiguity. By mid-January, several sealed jars appeared in the hospital storeroom, bearing no inventory number. A nurse named Clara Odell testified that they were filled with cloudy fluid and labeled only with dates, most from the weeks surrounding the storm. When she asked Dr. Hawks about them, he told her to dispose of them quietly, in the river if necessary. She obeyed, though she later claimed she dreamed for nights of faces drifting beneath the glass. The morgue remained locked until early February, when workers were ordered to dismantle the building for repairs. As they removed flooring, they uncovered a narrow tunnel extending under the foundation toward the hillside. Within lay remnants of wooden shelving, old linen sacks, and fragments of what appeared to be human hair. The work was halted immediately, and the county physician sealed the site again. No autopsies were performed on the fragments. The report filed simply listed unidentified organic debris. Merrow's name was struck from payroll, his whereabouts marked unknown. Yet months later, travelers along the Baltimore and Ohio line swore they saw a man matching his description boarding at scattered stations, quiet, wearing the same dark vest and cap, carrying a small trunk. Each sighting placed him farther south. By autumn 1909, the trail vanished entirely. The hospital reopened under new staff, and the basement was filled in, but among townsfolk, whispers persisted. They said that on certain foggy mornings, when the wind came from the river, the smell of disinfectant still drifted over the yard. Farmers crossing early claimed they heard faint metallic clinks beneath the soil, as if someone were arranging instruments in the dark. Even after the hospital burned partially through the years that followed, the story of Silas Merrow began to dissolve into something between memory and myth. The official files were transferred to the county archive in Cumberland, but several pages from Constable Latham's report were missing, torn neatly from the spine. A note in the index marked them as water-damaged, though no flood had ever been logged in the clerk's chamber. By 1911, a new medical wing had risen on the same ground where the old morgue once stood. Builders spoke of a hollow under the slab that caused the foundation to settle unevenly. The foreman, Mr. Albert Wynne, filed a complaint describing soft earth and timber remnants, but his letter drew no response. Wynne later told a journalist from the Baltimore Herald that he'd uncovered a row of small niches in the clay, each shaped like a crate, before the trench was hastily refilled. His remarks never made print. The editor struck them out, noting only unsourced speculation. In a surviving draft of the article, a margin note reads, "Locals mention former keeper Merrow, connection denied by authorities." That single line rekindled gossip in Grayson's Hollow. Older residents recalled the winter of 1908 as the year of the fog cellar. Church records from Reverend Paul Hensley described dwindling attendance and parishioners troubled by dreams of confinement. The Reverend himself later moved away, leaving behind a sermon titled, "The Man Who Waited in the Earth." Those who remained said that when the new hospital opened its surgical wing, certain doors were built narrower than standard, as if to discourage passage of stretchers. In that same decade, state inspectors reviewing rural medical facilities, part of reforms later cited in the history of Maryland, found irregular specimen transfers in several counties, Cumberland among them. No charges were filed, but an unnamed official hinted that a private intermediary operating in western districts vanished before inquiry. Many quietly believed this referred to Merrow. Meanwhile, travelers continued reporting strange encounters along the rail line. A letter dated 1913 from a porter on the Washington route mentioned a gentleman in outdated attire asking for freight tickets to places not on the schedule. The porter's description matched Merrow's perfectly down to the gray in his mustache. What disturbed investigators most was the trunk he carried, iron-bound, emitting a faint medicinal odor. The porter said the man insisted it be kept in a cold compartment. When questioned by police weeks later, the trunk and traveler had disappeared, and the ledger entry for that freight stub had been removed. In Grayson's Hollow, the old hospital well dried unexpectedly that same summer. Workmen digging to locate the blockage found fragments of glass and brass fittings tangled with human hair. They filled the shaft with lime and covered it over, erecting a wooden fence around it. The superintendent wrote, "No further digging. Soil unstable." Villagers avoided the spot afterward. In later testimonies collected during the 1930s, descendants of those workers spoke of whispers when the wind passed through the fence slats, soft, rhythmic, like breath through pipes. A child who played there claimed he once heard tapping from below, like someone calling with a spoon. Authorities dismissed such accounts as fables born of superstition, yet the pattern of unease remained. Even new arrivals to the area reported headaches, nosebleeds, and sleeplessness near the southern yard of the hospital grounds. Physicians blamed. By the winter of 1914, the new hospital building functioned normally, but the staff avoided its southern corridor. Nurses on the night shift complained of sudden drops in temperature, and patients claimed to hear rattling from beneath the floors. Superintendent Elmer Boyd requested a structural survey, yet when the engineer arrived, his report mentioned nothing of the noises. Instead, it contained an odd addendum. Airflow beneath the west wing inconsistent with ventilation diagrams, possible cavity beyond subfoundation wall. Boyd filed it away and chose silence. That same year, a medical student named Lawrence Hume began researching rural autopsy practices for his thesis at the University of Maryland. In reviewing hospital logs, he stumbled upon the name Merrow and visited Grayson's Hollow to request access to the morgue's old ledgers. What he found were copies of correspondence between Merrow and Dr. Hawkes, most heavily smudged. One line survived clearly: specimen retention permitted pending resolution of identity. Hume grew obsessed, telling peers that he believed Merrow had participated in early, unauthorized anatomical studies, part of a larger regional pattern hinted at in the history of Maryland. He spent 2 weeks in the town before leaving abruptly, abandoning his notes. In 1915, he was reported missing after taking a late train west. No trace of him was ever found. When the rail company examined his berth, they discovered only a parcel wrapped in newspaper, a small glass vial half filled with clear fluid, and a folded sheet labeled Grayson. Authorities never linked the incident formally to Merrow's file, but among local doctors, the rumor spread that Hume had uncovered the last specimen. In later accounts from a nurse named Odell, by then elderly, she said that on foggy mornings she could see faint footprints leading from the river toward the fenced yard, always vanishing near the old foundation. "It was like someone walked right back to where they'd come from," she told an interviewer. By 1916, a minor fire gutted part of the hospital's west wing. The blaze began in the record room and consumed all surviving morgue documents. Official cause: faulty wiring. Yet no electrical fixtures existed in that section. The lighting had remained gas. The archivist who investigated the loss noted something strange. The metal safe containing the payroll ledgers was warped outward, as though heat had come from inside. Reconstruction plans drew a new layout that deliberately avoided the old sublevel. Concrete was poured directly over the earlier foundation, sealing whatever voids lay beneath. For a brief time, the unease lifted. Workers joked that the keeper had finally been buried for good. But small incidents returned almost immediately. Glass jars left in storage would cloud overnight. Tools misplaced would reappear under locked cupboards, and a porter once fainted upon finding a handprint, small, precise, perfectly outlined in dust, on the inside of the trapdoor cover stored in the attic. He swore it hadn't been there the day before. Dr. Hawkes, now elderly, visited the site in 1917 to deliver a lecture on early medical forensics. Standing in the rebuilt corridor, he reportedly paused mid-sentence, listening, before muttering, "The stairs were longer than we thought." No one understood what he meant. He died the following year, and his private journal, when catalogued, ended with a half-page entry. Revisiting Grayson, air still sweet with carbolic, door never should have been closed. The handwriting faltered at the last line. Historians later debated whether the note was figurative or literal, but the archivist who transcribed it underlined one phrase in red pencil. Door never should have been closed. It remained the final written and mentioned. By 1918, as war news dominated Maryland's newspapers, the story of Grayson's Hollow was nearly forgotten. The hospital grounds served briefly as a convalescent station for returning soldiers, and the name Silas Merrow survived only as a half-whisper among older staff. Yet letters preserved in the county archive reveal that the Department of Health issued quiet instructions to inspect subterranean facilities for sanitary compliance. The inspector sent, Mr. Jonas Theron, filed his report in May 1918 and vanished 1 week later. His supervisor received a telegram from the Grayson station master stating that Theron had boarded the evening freight but never arrived at the next stop. His bag, recovered from the platform, contained sketches of a narrow corridor and a list of 6 measurements. Width 4', depth uncertain, odor, chemical, residue, unknown origin. The handwriting was shaky, the ink water-smudged. No one ever located the place he described. The rebuilding of Maryland's rural institutions during those years, chronicled in the History of Maryland, made brief mention of unreliable rural data due to structural inconsistencies in older medical sites. Though the phrase seems bland, researchers suspect it referred to hospitals like Grayson's Hollow. Surviving town residents said the land sank slightly that summer, forming a shallow depression near the southern fence. The superintendent ordered it filled, but every attempt failed. The soil collapsed as fast as they poured it. Men refused to work nights, claiming they heard muffled coughing beneath the earth. A telegram from the Board of Trustees simply noted, "Ground unstable, cease efforts until spring." The war ended before they returned, and the site lay untouched through 1919. When finally re-examined, the depression had hardened into a crusted patch of pale clay. Children dared each other to step on it. One slip. Ed swore he heard hollow echoes and ran home crying that someone knocked back. The following winter, the hospital's last caretaker, Mrs. Edith Klein, recorded in her diary that she sometimes woke to the faint smell of disinfectant drifting through cracks in the floorboards, though no chemicals were stored there anymore. She wrote, "Smell comes and goes, always when the wind blows from the south, always near the same hour before dawn." In 1920, when ownership of the property transferred to the county, officials ordered a final survey. The engineers found nothing unusual except for a sealed drainage culvert that led nowhere, ending abruptly in packed soil. They closed it and filed their papers. Years later, the culvert maps would vanish from record, replaced by blank pages labeled non-essential. Meanwhile, tales persisted among soldiers recovering in nearby towns who claimed they dreamed of descending staircases that grew longer the deeper they went, the smell of carbolic thickening with every step. One, identified as Private Henry Ross, described seeing a man below with light in his hands, but no face above his collar. When asked how he knew the man's name, he replied, "He told me to shut the door again." Ross died of fever 3 days later. His statement remained sealed in military medical archives until decades afterward. To this day, the town's elders maintain that nothing living grows properly on that section of ground. Grass sprouts pale and brittle, rainwater refuses to soak in. When visitors stand too long near the south fence. By the early 1920s, the hospital at Grayson's Hollow had been reduced to a regional infirmary, its reputation dimmed by whispers and dwindling patients. The building's south wing, constructed over the old morgue site, was avoided entirely, used only for storage of broken stretchers and surplus bedding. Clerks who entered there spoke of damp air that never dried, even in heat. One caretaker, Robert Mace, filed a maintenance note in 1921 that read simply, "Persistent moisture, unknown source, walls bleed faint residue of iodine." The county board ordered the area sealed again, but by 1922, another collapse exposed what looked like a hollow shaft behind the foundation stones. A laborer who peered inside described stacked bricks and a ladder made of nails descending at a slant. When he returned the next morning, the hole had filled itself with silt, as if the earth had shifted overnight. He refused to dig again. Records from that same period show correspondence between Cumberland officials and a professor named Harold Pennington, a historian compiling data for a study on early forensic practices in Maryland. Pennington requested access to the Grayson archives and particularly the Merrow case. His first letter was polite, his second more urgent, citing contradictions between county mortality figures and hospital receipts. His third, dated August 1922, contained one cryptic sentence: "The keeper's ledger is incomplete, and yet the numbers continue." No reply to this final letter survives. In 1923, Pennington disappeared en route to Cumberland. His luggage was found at the depot, including a notebook listing train times and scrawled in the margin, "West Stair under brick." A few months later, children exploring the outskirts of town uncovered a metal tag half buried in clay, stamped with the word "specimen" and the date 1908. The object was handed to Constable Latham Successed, Soar, who logged it as found debris and stored it in the station drawer. That drawer and its contents were destroyed in another unexplained fire 2 years later. The History of Maryland would later cite Grayson's Hollow, only in passing, describing periodic unrest in western counties tied to medical reform disputes. Yet oral accounts from the 1930s gathered by Works Progress researchers tell a darker continuity. Former hospital nurses claimed that during heavy rain the basement sump would collect clear fluid with a sweet chemical scent. They drained it nightly, yet by dawn it would return. An elderly orderly, long retired, told an interviewer that in his youth he'd seen the shape of a face form briefly on the puddle's surface. "Looked like it was waiting to breathe," he said, before asking the man to stop writing. That interview remains one of the last living references to Merrow before the Great Depression buried the story under larger troubles. By 1935, the hospital closed entirely, its windows boarded, and the land deeded to the county. Only then did workmen clearing the remaining debris report that the soil beneath the south wing sounded hollow when struck with shovels. The foreman ignored it, instructing them to pour concrete quickly to meet schedule. A laborer wrote decades later in a private letter, "It was like the ground wanted to be filled, like it was tired of being empty." Local folklore settled thereafter, softened by time, but some visitors still claim that the faint ringing of metal can be heard when the wind moves through the... By 1936, a government work crew arrived to clear the last ruins of the hospital. They came with trucks and drills, intending to demolish what remained of the cracked foundation and replace it with a small storage depot for county supplies. The foreman, Clyde Henner, recorded in his daily log that the soil was peculiarly hard on top, soft beneath, like thin crust over hollow bread. As they began to dig, several men reported a hollow sound with every strike of the shovel. Henner ordered the spot widened, but when they pried deeper, the earth released a rush of cold air so strong that one lantern extinguished itself. The men refused to continue until daylight. The following morning, frost covered the pit despite the warm weather. Witnesses later described a faint smell, sharp and sterile, like an overcleaned ward. Among the debris were fragments of glass tubing, rusted clamps, and a strip of cloth that might once have been part of a lab coat. The county engineer who arrived that afternoon signed off on the closure without inspection. He sealed the pit with lime and concrete, citing unstable soil and improper fill. Within weeks, a small warehouse rose over the site. Workers who stayed late complained of the building's chill and the odd rhythm of dripping when no pipes leaked. One clerk swore he heard footsteps under the floor. He left his post the next day. In the years that followed, the Merrow affair faded almost entirely from public record. Only scattered correspondences between minor officials hinted that something had once gone wrong there. In 1941, a historian revisiting the history of Maryland made a brief note that Western medical institutions of the early century show irregularities in specimen management. He cited Grayson's Hollow by initials only, GH, as an example of lost data. Then the war came again, and no one cared for ghosts beneath old foundations. and the warehouse remained standing until 1947 when lightning struck during a storm, setting the roof ablaze. Witnesses claim the flames burned blue before turning white, and even as the structure collapsed, no smoke rose, only steam. Firemen who entered later said the floor had buckled inward around a circular depression that hissed faintly. After the ashes cooled, nothing remained except blackened concrete and the warped iron hinges of what might have been a door. The county filled the hole and erected a fence, declaring the property condemned. By then, Grayson's Hollow was almost deserted. The railway had bypassed it, and new towns grew along the river. Yet those who still lived nearby swore that when the wind blew from the south, the faint smell of disinfectant returned. Hunters camping near the site reported hearing slow metallic sounds at night, like instruments being set in order. One claimed to see a dim lantern light beneath the cracked surface of the ground. Another said he dreamed of descending stairs slick with moisture, a man's voice whispering behind him, "Close it, for it breathes." None returned after that season. Today, the county map still lists the fenced parcel simply as Parcel 9A, restricted. Officially, it's vacant land awaiting redevelopment, but old residents say it is best left. By the late 1940s, Grayson's Hollow no longer appeared on most modern road atlases, reduced to a faint crossroad between routes that no one traveled. The county depot, built directly over the old Morgue ground, remained abandoned behind its iron fence. In 1949, an agricultural surveyor named Melvin Crowder was assigned to measure soil conditions for proposed farmland expansion. His notes, later archived in Annapolis, mentioned the Grayson parcel as unresponsive earth, damp below, sterile above. He described his instruments registering shallow vibrations as though from an underground current. Crowder wrote, "Every few seconds the gauge trembles not from wind, possibly from internal movement or air release." He left the site before completing his work and refused to return. The board's report marked his claim as instrument malfunction. Yet a month later, Crowder's assistant mailed a letter to a friend in Frederick stating that the hollow ground is not empty, it breathes like lungs. When investigators interviewed him, he retracted the statement, claiming exhaustion. Around this time, a local teacher, Mrs. Eliza Barstow, compiled a collection of oral histories from the region's oldest residents. One segment, labeled The Keeper's Steps, recounted the story of Silas Merrow almost word for word as it had circulated 40 years earlier. The storyteller, an aged farmer named Amos Steele, claimed he was the same man who once saw Merrow descend the morgue stairs. "He carried a lantern," Steele insisted, "and there was another light already waiting below. When asked what he thought it was, he replied, 'Another man, or maybe his reflection.' But they both moved." The recording was never released publicly. Mrs. Barstow's transcription ends with a single line. "Mr. Steele became ill during dictation and could not continue." His death certificate, filed weeks later, lists cardies, a failure. The recording, stored in a school cabinet, was lost during a renovation in 1952. Still, the legend survived quietly. Each decade brought another retelling, children daring each other to climb the fence, drifters carving initials into the warped concrete, dogs refusing to go near the south corner. In 1956, highway planners briefly considered running a new road through the area, but abandoned the proposal after survey rods kept sinking unexpectedly into the ground. The project foreman described the subsoil as honeycombed, unstable, hollow in tone. Engineers filled the test holes with cement and withdrew. That same year, a journalist researching unsolved Maryland disappearances uncovered mention of Merrow's name in an old hospital payroll. His article, "The Keeper of Grayson's Hollow," appeared in a regional magazine and revived local curiosity. Within weeks, trespassers began visiting the fenced lot. One group of college students claimed they found a section of concrete thin enough to break with hammers, revealing dark, damp clay beneath. They said a single iron rung was embedded there, leading downward into darkness. Only one student, a boy named Jeffries, dared to touch it. He said the metal was cold as ice, despite the July heat. 2 nights later, a storm struck the valley, flooding the site and washing debris toward the river. When authorities inspected afterward, they found nothing but a smooth surface of silt, the fence partly collapsed. No charges were filed, no arrests made. The article was withdrawn from circulation by its publisher, citing editorial concerns. Copies that remained in libraries were later noted to have entire pages torn out where the descriptions of the stairs had appeared. To this day, older residents of the surrounding counties still refer to Grayson's Hollow as the quiet ground, where no birds land and fog stays low long after sea. Unrise. Some say the hollow ground still exhales faintly, a soft, rhythmic pulse of air from beneath the soil. By 1961, the place once called Grayson's Hollow had vanished from county directories, its coordinates merged with the expanding State Forest Reserve. A single dirt track curved toward the fenced parcel that locals now called simply the Depot Ruins. That winter, a small group of geology students from Baltimore visited to take core samples, unaware of the site's history. Their professor, Dr. Leland Carter, later submitted a short paper to a regional science journal describing anomalous subsoil composition, presence of oxidized metals, and faint traces of phenol. Phenol, once used as a disinfectant in early morgues, connected their discovery to Maryland's medical past, though they did not realize it. Two of Carter's students, interviewed decades later, recalled something else left out of the report: the persistent hum that vibrated through their equipment whenever the drill reached 10 feet. It wasn't machinery, one said. It was too steady, like a breath under the ground. The State Survey Office filed Carter's findings under inconclusive. That same year, a reporter for the Cumberland Gazette rediscovered the old Merrow story while researching vanished towns. His article, The Keeper's Shadow, ran in October 1961 and briefly revived local fear. Letters poured into the newsroom from elderly residents recalling relatives who had worked at the hospital. One woman wrote that her grandfather had been part of the demolition crew in 1936 and that he found a doorway bricked shut from the inside. She added, "He never slept right after that." The paper printed only excerpts, omitting names, but within days, vandals broke into the fenced lot again. They tore through the warped boards, leaving footprints in the mud. The sheriff's deputies found traces of candle wax near the center of the concrete slab, arranged in a ring. The wax smelled of medicine. No arrests were made, and the newspaper quietly ceased follow-up coverage. The History of Maryland was updated that same decade with a new section on the modernization of state hospitals, referencing the failures of early rural institutions. It mentioned, without naming Grayson's Hollow, a Western facility abandoned after repeated contamination incidents. Scholars later concluded this line was a veiled nod to Merrow's domain. By the 1970s, nature had reclaimed most of the area. Trees grew through the cracks and vines covered the last visible wall. Yet hikers reported strange resistance when digging sticks into the ground near the center. The soil sounded hollow. One camper, interviewed in 1978, claimed that during a thunderstorm he saw a flicker of light below the surface, like a lantern trapped under glass. He thought lightning caused it, until he realized the light pulsed independently of the flashes. He left before dawn. When rangers visited the next morning, they found the earth disturbed and faint impressions of parallel lines, as if stairs had pressed upward from below. The ranger's report concluded with one dry sentence: no geological explanation. Over the years, new maps of the forest omitted the precise coordinates of the site. Only older survey charts still mark a shaded circle labeled Restricted Depression. The rest of Grayson's Hollow exists now only in fragmented testimony and forgotten files, the story of the keeper reduced to rumor. Yet some nights, after heavy rain, locals say fog gathers low and unmoving over that ground. If you stand near the fence, you can hear. By the late 1970s, the legend of the Morgue keeper had passed almost entirely into folklore, told around campfires by those who barely believed their own words. Yet the land refused to rest. In 1979, a developer named Daniel Price purchased several parcels bordering the old Depot ruins with plans to build seasonal cabins for hunters. His crew began clearing brush near the southern edge, unaware of what lay beneath. On the third day of work, the bulldozer struck something metallic. The engine stalled instantly. When the driver climbed down to investigate, he found the blade had hooked an iron ring embedded in a slab of concrete. Price noted the discovery in his field ledger. Possible drainage cap or old well cover, removed next week. But that night, the equipment alarm sounded twice. Guards arriving on site found the machine's floodlights still burning and the ground around the ring disturbed, as if something had shifted underneath. The next morning, Price ordered the area surveyed before continuing. The technician reported a void roughly 10 feet below surface level, consistent with a collapsed chamber. By afternoon, the ring itself had vanished, leaving only a clean circle of exposed clay. Price abandoned the lot and sold his claim before the month ended. His letter to the county clerk described soil instability and personal unease. The clerk underlined those final words before filing them away. The history of Maryland around that time carried new commentary on the disappearance of early county records, fires, water damage, misfiled ledgers, offering a plausible reason why cases like Merrow's survived only in rumor. Yet some scholars noticed how many of those missing files originated from the same western region. In 1983, an archivist named Ruth Calden attempted to reconstruct the Grayson documents for a thesis on lost rural institutions. She traced Hawkes's correspondence. Dents, located a few burned payroll slips, and even identified the signature of Constable Latham in faded ink. Her notes mention faint carbolic odor on one surviving page. The chemical should have evaporated decades earlier. Calden's colleagues dismissed it as coincidence until she, too, went missing during a weekend field visit. Her car was found near the forest gate, keys still in the ignition, and her recorder left on the seat. The final minutes captured her voice reading a line from Latham's report. Cover secured, no motion, air stale. Then silence, followed by a slow, hollow knocking. 3 times, spaced evenly apart. The tape ends there. Investigators concluded she must have fallen or been lost in the woods, but search dogs refused to cross the inner fence. The case was quietly closed. By the late 1980s, the state declared the area ecologically sensitive, citing underground water flow, and forbade further construction. Fines were posted for trespassing. Still, hunters and drifters kept returning, drawn by curiosity. They reported the same uneasy phenomena, lantern-like glows, faint metallic scents, and the echo of slow footsteps when the wind died. One ranger's log from 1988 notes, ground movement recorded at 0312 HRs, like breathing, recheck sensors, no animals nearby. His superior ordered the note deleted from official transcripts, but copies circulate privately among staff. Even today, when mist settles over that patch of Maryland forest, old-timers claim the air. By the early 1990s, Grayson's Hollow had become a blank spot on modern maps, but its legend persisted in whispers among historians, rangers, and a handful of aging locals. In 1992, a television crew filming a documentary on Lost Maryland sought permission to record at the site. The Department of Natural Resources denied entry, yet 2 members of the team visited on their own one night, ignoring the warning signs. The footage recovered from their abandoned camera begins with static, then a slow pan of the tree line under heavy fog. A voice off camera says, "There's no sound, not even crickets." Minutes later, the lens focuses on the old concrete depression. A faint vibration distorts the audio, followed by a hiss like escaping steam. The film ends abruptly after a single whispered word, "Below." Both men were found wandering miles away at dawn, disoriented, clothes damp with condensation that smelled faintly of phenol. Medical tests showed no injuries, but one man suffered recurring dreams of descending stairs. When asked what he saw, he muttered, "A man polishing glass in the dark." The documentary was never aired. The footage was seized by local authorities and catalogued as evidence in a trespassing case. Around that time, a young archivist named Samuel Hart uncovered a misfiled folder in the state library containing Dr. Hawkes's original employment contract and several notes referencing Silas Merrow by name. One sheet bore a small thumbprint smudged with an oily residue. Laboratory testing confirmed traces of formaldehyde and human tissue decay products, chemicals long obsolete by 1908 standards. Hart grew obsessed,
publishing a brief article in a historical journal suggesting Merrill's work might have connected to unrecorded anatomical research conducted in Western Maryland during the Progressive Era, as noted in the History of Maryland. Days after publication, Hart
reported receiving phone calls of faint breathing and static, though his number was unlisted. He told colleagues it was probably crossed wires. A week later, while visiting Cumberland to inspect remaining hospital archives, he disappeared. His rental car was discovered near the Forest Service Road, with the engine running, radio tuned to static, and a small recorder on the dashboard. The tape contained only ambient air, punctuated once by a soft metallic clink. No one has identified the sound. By 1995, county officials placed a concrete barrier across the access trail and posted new warning plaques. They read simply, "Danger, unstable ground, no entry." Despite the restriction, reports continued. Hikers claimed their compasses failed near the old depot lot. Others described hearing faint hammering when rain struck the ground. A local priest who visited to bless the site later told parishioners the earth felt too hollow to hold a blessing. The following year, an earthquake tremor, barely measurable, shook western Maryland. Though minor, its epicenter aligned precisely with the coordinates of Grayson's Hollow. No damage was reported elsewhere. Scientists dismissed it as coincidence, yet residents swore the ground there briefly exhaled a plume of mist that lingered for hours. One witness said he heard a voice beneath the wind repeating, "Close the door." As the century turned, the story of the morgue keeper seemed destined to fade into archives and folklore, yet those who live nearby insist the soil still stirs when storms roll through. They say the sound that rises is not thunder, but breathing. By the late 1990s, few outside western Maryland remembered the name Grayson's Hollow, yet inside small circles of archivists and independent researchers, it lingered like a half-erased note. In 1998, a local historian named Peter Loring published a pamphlet titled Forgotten Hospitals of the Potomac Valley. He devoted 2 pages to the Lost Infirmary, cautiously describing it as a vanished facility once associated with unverified anatomical study. Loring claimed to have interviewed an unnamed ranger who described low vibrations under the forest floor that would rise and fall in rhythm like the beating of an unseen heart. His writing stirred mild public curiosity, but also anger from the State Preservation Office, which accused him of spreading superstition. Within months, Loring retracted his statement, though friends later said he stopped sleeping in quiet rooms, insisting he needed the noise of traffic to cover that low pulse. In 1999, a small landslide occurred after weeks of heavy rain. Satellite imagery recorded a shallow sink forming near the site's center. When engineers arrived, they found the soil steaming despite the cold air. Chemical tests showed faint traces of phenol and iron oxides, the same residues first identified decades earlier by Dr. Carter's team. The discovery reignited speculation about buried medical waste. Officials downplayed the findings, stating historic contamination, non-hazardous. But the next morning, one technician failed to report for duty. His truck was found idling by the fence, the driver's door open, tire tracks circling the depression as if he had driven around it several times before stopping. His name was never publicly released. Later that year, a state survey labeled the region geologically unstable, and the entire parcel was reclassified as protected land, effectively sealing it from further excavation. Those who work had on the report admitted quietly that their instruments malfunctioned each time they neared the center. Compass needles spun, and microphones recorded low-frequency vibrations that defied explanation. Around the same time, a historian revising the history of Maryland added a final note on early 20th century medical practices in isolated counties. In one footnote, without naming Grayson's Hollow, he mentioned persistent folklore of a keeper beneath the floorboards of a rural infirmary. That was the last academic mention of the case, yet locals claim that after the sinkhole sealed itself, the forest grew unnaturally lush. Trees at the perimeter thrived, but those at the center remained pale, their bark smooth and cold even in midsummer. Hunters who wandered too close reported losing their bearings. hearing the clink of metal or the distant roll of wheels on stone. Some returned with dizziness and the scent of disinfectant on their clothes, though they had touched nothing but leaves. A county worker repairing signage in 2001 wrote in his logbook, "Fence post lifted overnight though ground undisturbed. Heard something shifting below. Felt like breath." His supervisor crossed out the line before submitting the final report. And so the place endures, sealed beneath layers of denial and earth, a faint reminder that some stories refuse to be buried. Those who study old maps say the hollow lies directly beneath a patch of forest where no roots take hold, a space where the ground itself. By the early 2000s, Grayson's Hollow was little more than a ghost coordinate in Maryland's land registry, yet its silence continued to draw those who dealt in forgotten places. In 2003, a small team from a private archaeology group received limited access to conduct a soil survey after lobbying the county for months. Their leader, Dr. Evelyn Rourke, specialized in medical history and believed the hollow concealed a storage vault linked to early 20th century anatomical studies, the same pattern faintly referenced in the history of Maryland. She brought infrared scanners and ground sensors, documenting every step in a diary later recovered from her office. The entries began confidently, describing steady readings and uniform clay, but on the third day they changed tone. Rourke noted inconsistent echo under the southern grid, repetitive like measured breathing. Her team planned to excavate a shallow trench the next morning. At dawn, camp neighbors heard what they described as metallic thuds followed by a low hiss. When officials arrived hours later, the campsite was intact but empty, equipment left running. The scanners had recorded a rhythmic vibration lasting 42 minutes before stopping abruptly. The trench showed no disturbance, only compacted soil as if pressed down from below. The investigation that followed labeled the disappearances a tragic accident. Possible sinkhole collapse, though no cavity was found. The state resealed the area and revoked all research permits indefinitely. Years later, the recovered diary surfaced in a museum auction, half the pages fused by moisture. One surviving line reads, "The keeper is not gone. He keeps the silence breathing." From then on, any academic mention of Grayson's Hollow came wrapped in skepticism. Yet rangers maintained internal memos noting small ground tremors, each accompanied by a faint odor of disinfect. "Tant drifting through the valley." A 2006 maintenance report warned, "Soil pressure fluctuates seasonally, like lungs expanding." That sentence was quietly edited in official copies to read, "Ground moisture varies." In 2008, on the centennial of the original events, a local historical society attempted to host a memorial talk titled The Morgue Keeper, 1908. Days before the event, the venue flooded from a broken pipe that released water clear but scented faintly of phenol. The hall reopened weeks later, the lecture canceled. Some called it coincidence. Others refused to speak of it. Even today, hikers claim that when the fog sits thick over that part of the forest, the air hums faintly, almost like the turning of glass instruments below the surface. Those who pause to listen too long often feel the earth shift once, slowly, like a door adjusting on its hinges. That is when locals say you. By 2010, the hollow had settled into uneasy obscurity, officially designated a conservation zone. Few entered its boundary except forestry workers checking erosion sensors. That summer, a technician named Carla Dent filed an internal report about faint vibrations registering on her equipment whenever thunderstorms rolled through the valley. The signal repeated every 7 seconds, lasting minutes at a time, like breath drawn through walls. Her supervisor dismissed it as resonance from the storm, yet the file was quietly labeled Archived Anomaly. Around the same period, a graduate student from Baltimore University named Owen Redd undertook a thesis on forgotten medical facilities of Maryland. He traced records of Silas Merrow and Dr. Marion Hawks through state archives, confirming both men's employment in 1908, but finding their termination records missing. Redd's research cross-referenced construction blueprints of the old hospital with county land maps and discovered an unmarked corridor beneath the current conservation zone, exactly where the depression still sat. He proposed visiting the site with permission, but received no reply from authorities. In his final thesis draft, Red wrote, "It appears the cellar beneath Grayson's Hollow was not destroyed but absorbed, its dimensions identical to a known morgue annex design patented in 1907. 2 months later, he withdrew from the program and vanished from public record. His advisor told reporters that Red had become overly invested in local legend. His laptop, later recovered from a pawn shop, contained only a single open file, an image of ground radar showing a series of parallel lines descending into darkness. In the metadata were 4 words: stairs intact, door closed. No further trace of him surfaced. Meanwhile, rangers noted that wildlife around the zone behaved oddly. Birds circled, but would not land. Deer skirted the perimeter even when chased. In 2012, a new road project required minor grading near the edge of the old depot fence. Workers unearthed a piece of corroded metal shaped like a hinge. Testing showed iron alloy dating to early 1900s manufacture, corroded unevenly as if exposed to both moisture and heat. The discovery never made the news. County engineers simply poured fresh fill and paved over it. But that autumn, residents of a nearby farmhouse began reporting a low hum rising from the ground during heavy rain. One described it as a heartbeat trapped in mud. By winter, the sound stopped as suddenly as it began. The county issued a notice restricting nighttime entry to the forest, citing unstable terrain. Yet hikers continued to speak of faint rhythmic tapping echoing through fog, sometimes 2 knocks, sometimes 3, always from below. The history of Maryland remains unchanged, its mention of Western medical irregularities buried in a footnote no one reads. But within the town archives, a librarian once found a sealed envelope without postmark, containing a brittle photograph of the old morgue's foundation. Scrawled on the back in fading ink were the words, "Still breathing, still beneath." No one could determine who sent it. The photograph. By 2015, the Hollow's reputation had become the province of ghost hunters and amateur historians. Internet forums circulated grainy satellite images and whispered about missing hikers. Most claims were exaggerated, but a few details matched official maintenance logs: the recurring ground tremors, the strange temperature drops, and the persistent chemical scent recorded after rainfall. That year, a documentary team applied for access, offering to include environmental restoration footage alongside their film. The county reluctantly agreed under supervision. Their project, Under the Maryland Soil, began filming in late autumn. For the first 2 days, the crew captured nothing unusual except the desolate quiet of the forest. On the 3rd night, their microphones picked up a steady rhythmic tone too low for the human ear, but visible on audio monitors as perfect, symmetrical waves. It continued for exactly 42 minutes, then stopped mid-beat. The supervising ranger noted it mirrored the pattern logged during the 2003 disappearance of Dr. Evelyn Rourke's team. When the crew returned to review their footage, they found a single frame corrupted. A blurred outline of a man's face staring upward through fog, eyes open, expression blank, framed by what appeared to be the edge of a trap door. Technical experts later called it lens flare combined with condensation, but sound engineers couldn't explain the pulse. The documentary aired only once on a regional station before the network pulled it for rights clarification. Copies circulated online briefly and were then removed after alleged copyright strikes. Since then, no official images of the Hollow have surfaced. In 2017, a journalist writing an anniversary piece about Maryland's unsolved disappearances mentioned Silas Merrow as a symbol of archival loss. She linked him to early rural pathology experiments discussed in TASH. The History of Maryland, calling him the invisible worker who outlived his own record. Weeks after publication, her office received an unmarked package containing a small glass jar sealed with wax. Inside was clear liquid and a folded scrap of paper reading, "Specimen retained pending resolution of identity." The label's handwriting matched Merrow's preserved ledger signature from 1908. Authorities dismissed it as a hoax, but the jar was lost before testing. The journalist quit her job soon after, moving out of state. By 2019, the conservation zone was overgrown, the fence rusting away. Storm runoff expose fragments of the original concrete slab. Visitors described faint metallic clangs when raindrops struck certain spots. One hiker who recorded the sound claimed it formed a pattern: 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, repeated steadily like Morse code. He uploaded the file online with coordinates, but the post was deleted within days. Those who downloaded it described hearing whispers layered beneath the rhythm, a man's voice saying softly, "The door is still closed." Whether the words existed or were imagined remains uncertain. Yet the frequency of tremors increased that winter. Small ripples felt across the valley floor. Locals began reporting fog that rose from the ground even on clear nights, carrying the scent of disinfectant and burnt iron. Rangers sealed the trails indefinitely, posting a final notice: ground subsidence risk, area unsafe. But those who live nearby swear the fog hasn't moved since. By 2020, the hollow had become a forbidden subject in official circles. The state's Environmental Bureau quietly reclassified the area as a sealed geological reserve, a designation used only for zones deemed chemically or structurally unstable. On paper, it was closed for ecological recovery. But off the record, rangers admitted the soil readings were irregular. Instruments detected periodic pulses of carbon dioxide without any organic cause. They came at predictable intervals, every 7 hours, nearly exact, rising like exhalations. That spring, a researcher from the University of Maryland, Dr. Lydia Crane, requested permission to study the emissions, believing they indicated trapped microbial life. Her request was denied. She went anyway, entering the reserve alone one night with a portable sensor. At 3:14 a.m., her equipment transmitted one final reading. Pressure spike, approx. 200 psi. The signal cut abruptly. Search teams found only her sensor, still warm, its casing cracked outward as though by internal force. Crane herself was never located. A week later, faint tremors rippled through western Maryland. The official explanation cited groundwater shifts after heavy rain, yet the pattern matched historical vibration logs from 1918 and 2003. 42 minutes long, steady, rhythmic. The echo of breathing beneath the soil. Locals said the fog that year did not rise but seeped, low, spreading across the trees like liquid. Hunters reported metallic odors and the faint clink of chains or tools from underfoot. The few who approached the fence claimed to hear muffled scraping, 3 slow knocks, then silence. Within months, the state built a secondary barrier around the reserve, higher and reinforced, and declared it off-limits indefinitely. Still, people found ways in. Drone hobbyists posted brief aerial clips showing dark indentations in the ground forming a perfect rectangle, 12 by 9 meters, a line precisely where the old morgue once stood. The images were removed within hours, replaced by government notices citing privacy violations. A handful of researchers preserved copies. One frame shows a faint grid pattern across the surface, almost like steps descending beneath translucent earth. In that same year, a revised edition of the History of Maryland quietly omitted the section referencing rural medical irregularities. The chapter jumped cleanly from industrial growth to modern healthcare reform, as if nothing had existed between. Archivists noticed the missing pages, but found no earlier draft. In the official record, Grayson's Hollow had finally ceased to exist. Yet those who live near the valley insist the silence is never complete. On humid nights, when fog curls across the fence, they say you can still hear the soft thud of something adjusting below, like drawers sliding or lids closing gently. A few older residents remember the words once spoken by Constable Latham in 1908 when he first sealed the trapdoor: "Cover secured, no motion, air stale." More than a century later, by 2025, the hollow had turned into silence itself, fenced by rust and government paperwork. The forest grew thick, swallowing the last paths, and the ground where the morgue once stood had hardened into glassy clay. Official documents listed the area as Environmental Recovery Sector G12, but no ranger had stepped beyond the inner barrier in years. Satellites caught heat anomalies there every spring, perfectly rectangular, fading as quickly as they formed. The state called them thermal refractions. Locals called them the Breath. In March, a restoration drone flew over to record erosion data. Its camera streamed for 6 minutes before cutting off mid-flight. The recovered footage showed nothing unusual at first: dense canopy, patches of pale soil, until the final frame captured a flicker of reflected light, deep beneath the surface, moving against the grain of the earth as though something below had turned its head upward. Analysts wrote it off as compression error. Yet 2 days later, faint tremors registered across western Maryland, the same steady pulse logged a century earlier by Constable Latham's lantern. For 42 minutes the valley breathed. Then, as always, it went still. The history of Maryland remains quiet on the matter, its missing pages never restored, its footnotes trimmed to polite obscurity. But in the private collections of archivists and wanderers, copies of those vanished records circulate, each marked by the same fading line written by an unknown hand: cover secured, no motion, air stale. The words have become a kind of prayer for those who study the hollow, a reminder to leave buried things buried. And still, on nights when fog clings low and the wind presses through the trees, some claim to hear the faint creak of metal beneath the ground, a whispering draft rising from the soil that smells of carbolic and cold stone. They say, if you list, and too long, you can hear the soft shuffle of footsteps pacing below, the keeper tending his instruments as he always did, patient